All right. Well, I'm going to start today with a story. And this happened maybe only a year ago when we got a new lead at Four Kitchens. And it was different. There was no referral or conference connection, just no prior relationship. A client who was just already convinced, certain that we were the right team to work for them. And I work mostly in higher ed, so this is very rare. Had to ask the obvious question, how'd you find out about us? And they said, ChatGPT recommended you. Well, it was awesome. I was excited. This felt like scale, like, ooh, someone's been reading all our work, understanding it, and then they're out there advocating for us around the clock in rooms I'm not even invited to. But then that exciting exhilaration faded a little bit. It became a little more of a quiet, unsettling feeling like ChatGPT is talking about us, and we have no idea what it's saying. And that's the tension I really want to talk about today. Not the flattery part, but the loss of control. Because I think most of us have had an experience like that at some point now, and we don't even have the language yet to talk about it. It's new. I want to show you what exactly this means because only a few months later, I experienced it from the other side. I was planning my daughter's birthday party, and in the winter where I live, you have to go indoors, and that means I'm looking for anything that's not like a questionable trampoline gym. My family spends a lot of time just down the street at the local university going to all the athletic events, so basketball, football, hockey. And I thought, well, that seems like a natural place to go. And I did what I think a lot of us are doing now. I didn't go to Google. I went to ChatGPT and I asked a simple question, birthday party options at the university athletic events. And the answer came back was thoughtful. It was specific. It talked about group ticket packages, university branded gift bags, a custom seating area. And then the one thing stopped me completely in my tracks. There was a hockey package where the birthday kid could ride the Zamboni during intermission. And I was sold. Like if I could put my kid on a Zamboni, I've basically won parent of the year. Full stop. This was going to happen. I'm telling my family about it. I'm planning the guest list. I went to book it and I couldn't find details anywhere. I searched the athletics site, the main university website. I'm going like deeper into those search results than a human ever would until I found a news article that was about 8 years old describing exactly what ChatGPT told me. It was the same package with the same details, the branded items, the Zamboni ride, but it was real clear this was a past initiative, something that existed once but no longer did. I called to confirm the program hadn't been around for years. Now, no one was harmed. Like, we found something else to do. It's just an ordinary disappointment. But what it revealed to me is that, like, the information from ChatGPT, it wasn't fabricated. It wasn't a hallucination, not in the way we usually talk about that word. It was accurate at one point in time. The content was still there, buried past relevance for any human searcher, like effectively invisible to us. But to a system that reads everything, it was just as valid as the stuff that was published last week. The content's still present, part of the record, still shaping what that institution was understood to offer. And that news article, that was old. It was never retired though. It was never outdated or connected to anything that was a replacement. There was no signal that like this was a thing and its time had passed. It just sat there in the dark, still teaching. Now I know where a lot of us are at, and I imagine it's the case at a lot of your institutions. We're all waiting for guidance, for governance frameworks. We're waiting for leadership to define like what does responsible AI really look like? And that caution's earned. Higher ed in particular, we have an obligation around privacy and academic integrity, around equity. So this deliberation is appropriate. But there's a distinction I want to make very clear today. Adoption is a choice, exposure is not. You don't have to deploy an AI tool for AI to be shaping your institution's reputation. These systems aren't waiting for your policy committee to finish its work. They're already reading your website. They've already processed your content. They're already forming a portrait of who you are, what you offer, and what's worth recommending, all before a prospective customer, student, connection clicks a single link. Before they see that homepage that you've agonized over or enter a funnel that you spent years designing. And maybe even worse, you can't see this happening. I mean, maybe there's a drop in your traffic, but there's no dashboard or tag that says, here's all the AI stuff that I'm not invited into that conversation. According to a national survey of more than 5,000 high school students published by EAB just this February, they found that 46% of students are now using AI tools in their college search. And this is nearly double from just 6 months earlier. Nearly 1 in 5 have already removed a college from consideration based on what AI told them. Not based on a campus visit, not talking to a missions counselor, not getting a brochure. Just whatever a natural language model assembled from whatever they knew about that institution. Your content's not just being read, it's being used to make decisions that affect you, even before anyone reaches out to you. So the question here isn't, should I start thinking about AI? We're beyond that. It's what have we already taught it? And in 2025, very recent history, we crossed a threshold that I think a lot of us missed entirely. For the first time in the history of the internet, as like we talk about it, humans became the minority audience. And according to the Aperva Bad Bot report, automated traffic is now over 51% of web activity. Check your server logs, it's already there. And that volume is almost besides the point because what matters is the nature of the traffic. It's completely changed. It used to be that a search bot would index your site and gather content and then send people back to you. It was kind of a fair exchange in its own way. I give you data, you give me traffic, but that's over. Cloudflare recently published some figures that has really reframed what I think about this exchange. They said that AI bots may crawl a site 887 times for every single human visitor that they return. 887 reads for one person. That's not the discovery model we're used to. This is extraction. And we've watched this happen. I think we've all felt the influx of bots. Actually, this was over a year ago now. A university client saw this massive, sustained spike in their traffic. It was like triple their normal traffic, ongoing. And at first they were elated, like, oh, our content's finally resonating. We hit a new audience. But the engineers looked closer, and it wasn't a real audience. It was ChatGPT bot, Claude bot, others scanning the entire site simultaneously, wall to wall. In one case documented by Fastly, they showed single AI crawlers making over 39,000 requests per minute to a single domain. And at that scale, you're not talking about being read, you're being consumed. And luckily, we get to pay for that compute bill for that lovely privilege. But I said it's not just about the traffic. And I think this is what makes it structurally different from what we've designed before. We've spent decades perfecting user journeys and getting pretty good at it, talking about personas, doing UX testing, carefully architecting funnels that lead someone through a pipeline, trying to establish homepages that are engineered to establish trust in 3 seconds. And all of this is built on a foundational assumption so obvious we never thought to state it. The audience comes through a front door. Well, these AI systems don't. They're not navigating, not in the traditional sense. They see your hierarchy, but they're not making decisions based on it because they're not following a path. They're extracting. They're extracting without discrimination. So that polished program page that you spent months trying to craft to perfection, and that PDF 2014 _ revision 2 final that's buried on some subdomain, well, they're both content to the crawler. Or the mission statement that you've updated proudly against the 4 conflicting versions of a faculty bio. They're both content carrying in many ways equal weight. And your brand guidelines you've spent months developing to these systems are nearly invisible. Now, the university I mentioned that was getting hit with the bots, they had a program finder, and this was one of the biggest issues to resolve. You likely have something similar. It's layered with different filters. I can sort by grad or undergrad or program type, college department, maybe where I'm going in my journey. It's a major sales pipeline for prospective students. And for that audience, it's a navigation tool. From a machine's perspective, though, it's this coordinated grid where every one of those filters can be combined with another one. And these facets become just staggering math where you hit 30 filters and it's over 1 billion URL combinations. And actually this one had 10 more than that. So that's 1 trillion facets, more addressable pages than the entire Google index, but all of them hosted on your servers. They're all generating signal, but none of them really adding meaning. To a person, it's a filter system, but to a machine, it's a maze with infinite paths and no exit. And the machine's going to attempt every single one of those. So when we step back and we look what had gone wrong, these crawl storms going through the combinatorial explosions, the AI system not having a real complete picture of the institution. This seemed easy to diagnose and just say, oh, it's a bad interface. The filters are confusing. If you fix the navigation, then the UX will be repaired. The problem will go away. But I don't think it's that easy. because the problem isn't really the system underneath being serviced a certain way. It's that the system underneath didn't know what it was describing. We had pages that are a view into programs, and we have filters to get you to programs, navigation to get different audiences through content, maybe to programs. What we didn't have was a coherent, consistent definition of what a program is. So we always solve this at the surface. Let's have some better layouts. Let's have cleaner search, more tagging to relate things. And for a long time, that was sufficient because our audience was human, and humans are real forgiving. We'll look at something, we infer, we fill in the gaps. We choose the interpretation that makes the most sense. Our brains are really good at that. And then we move on. Machines don't do that. They're not picking the best version of content. They're not resolving the ambiguity between two different versions. They're just learning from what's present. And if the content you're showing is fragmented, duplicated, or inconsistent, well, then that's just what gets learned. It's what gets surfaced. And it's what the next prospective student hears when they ask AI whether this institution's a right fit. I should say, I spent a lot of time with higher ed, but I don't think any of these lessons are strictly to a higher ed. So if you're not in that industry, I know most of you are, know that this is going to fall along to any decision we make. Because for decades, we've been creating systems of presentation of what's important to us, but what we need is systems of understanding. And that distinction, presentation versus understanding, is something I want to make concrete, and I'm going to keep on the higher ed example to do it, because this is way easier to see in practice than to talk in theoretical principle. Let me show you what it looks like. Not that long ago, we began work with North Dakota State University. And that first challenge, it wasn't design and it wasn't navigation. Those are normally the first things we look at. It wasn't even content quality in the conventional sense. It was competition, and not competition from other institutions, internal competition, because the university was in fact arguing with itself, a problem that really hadn't gotten recognized. There were department pages that were describing programs. There were college pages describing those same programs, recruitment pages for the prospective students, catalog pages, mainly for current students. All of these were accurate in their own way, maybe partially the same, partially different, because they're written for different audiences at different times, pulling different descriptions of slightly the same but different things. Now, for a prospective student, for that person who's new to your organization, this can create a feeling they don't quite understand. They're moving through your site. They see slightly different versions of the same content. It just doesn't add up. It's not wrong exactly. It's just kind of off. The dates are off. The outcomes are off. Maybe something's tagged differently or described differently. And I think the risk is losing confidence. I mean, they're not going to file a complaint. They're just going to close the browser tab. That's a human cost. Machine cost can be a lot worse. Because when an AI system encounters competing description of the same thing, it's not going to pick the most accurate one. That's kind of what we're used to in the SEO world, trying to compete for authority. In 2024, there was a survey of knowledge conflicts in large language models, and this was published by the Empirical Methods in Natural Language Processing, which is a leading conference in the field. It found that systems tend to favor whatever version of a fact appears more frequently in the sources, not which one's the most accurate or which one's the most authoritative. And so that department page that got copied 3 times, maybe for different audiences or different events, is probably going to outweigh the canonical description. Volume beats accuracy, and whatever wins shapes the answers that follow to every student who asks on every platform indefinitely. So the internal competition, it wasn't just a content problem. It was slowly, invisibly corrupting the institution's own signals. So we had to fix this. And we approached the issue by doing something a little more foundational. We asked, what is a program? Not rhetorical, like structurally, what is it? What are the required attributes? What does a program connect to? What does it exist with? What does it exist and can't exist without? What surrounds it to make it legible, like as a credential, as an experience, as a community? And what kind of content would you need so that, in this case, our primary audience was a prospective student, that they would have to see to say, yeah, that's the right degree for me. And so we built a new program content type and a lot of other things in the data model to create something that was more than just a system of record. There was one canonical description, degree levels and credential variations modeled explicitly, associated departments, colleges, declared through relationships, and these things that were normally on the page were just passing prose, but now they're written in a very structured way, including career outcomes, that were structured and consistent, formatted the same way, functioning a lot like marketing copy, but it was annotated and sourced. It was verifiable. It's because the program wanted to be more than just a credential. It wanted to be more than just a moment of description. It was a model. A 17-year-old deciding where they want to spend the next 4 years. They're not asking, like, what courses am I going to take? They're asking something a little harder. Like, can I see myself there? And this is part of what we built, where students' stories became first-class contents in the model. They're not testimonials that are sort of sprinkled across the site. They're structured entities in their own right. A student's story knows which programs it belongs to, which college, which career path it could lead to. And it can be surfaced anywhere that relationship's relevant, so it travels with the program. This carries something a little different. It's proof. A student who studied environmental engineering and now leads a watershed restoration project at a firm in Minneapolis. This isn't a quote in a sidebar. It's evidence that she took this path, it's real, and someone else could walk it. It's a promise that what's being claimed on this website is something that's achievable by you. And no amount of our institutional copy that we're used to writing from a specific voice at a specific time is going to be a good substitute for that. The model's treating this now as a new asset. We did something similar with buildings and locations, and I kind of want to sit with that for a moment because, I mean, this surprised even me. And I'm used to thinking about content models, but buildings in a virtual environment, that physical space carries extraordinary weight. And it was in one of our first meetings, we all talked about what excited us as like undergraduate students going. And for me, it was a lot of technical labs, not just like seeing what the amenities look like, but trying to say, is that somewhere I want to be? A cool research lab, fabrication studio, or a clinical trading facility. These are more than photographs in a gallery. They're signals that work happens here. These are the people who do it, and that there's room for a person like me considering being a part of it. When a building is modeled as a content entity with its own attributes, its own connections to departments, programs, research areas, it stops being just a background picture or scenery. It becomes part of that argument. Career earning data worked a similar way. The goal wasn't to impress. Like, obviously we want that, but it was to be believed. Because student families, they become fluent in spotting salary statistics that really only appear when they're convenient, or maybe they're sourced vaguely or formatted differently on every page. When the data is structured, it's consistently attribute and it's sort of woven into every program that it relates to. It stops being just a claim placed on a page. It starts to look like a fact. And that distinction in the mind of a skeptical prospective student is everything. Student life content like clubs, housing, traditions, community, they're also connected to programs through explicit content relationships. Not assembled individually on pages, copy and pasted where helpful, related, maintained once, which means it stays current everywhere it appears, telling the same story regardless of surface or who's contributing at any given time. To take a step back and look at this at scale, this is more than just content types or taxonomies or relationships. What we're building is an entire graph where a program connects to a department belongs to a college occupies a building, buildings host research, research involves faculty, faculty mentors students, students become alumni, have careers, careers have outcomes. It's a system that validates itself and stays up to date because it's not a list, it's a graph. It's self-sustaining because of the explicit relationships. Every node maintained once, every connection intentional, every surface, whether it's the recruitment page, the course catalog page, or the departmental site, or even outside your site, that AI assistant talking to a prospective student on a random Sunday night. They're all drawing from the same source of truth, not because someone synchronized them manually, but because they were never separate to begin with. So if you build that system, AI can represent you more accurately. I mean, if you don't build it, it's still going to represent you anyways. So let's talk about what we probably need to leave behind. And these are things I see at institutions of all size, things that used to be harmless, but really aren't anymore. Let's see. First here, a department that publishes content outside of the navigation, probably because internal governance reasons, someone doesn't have access, so they can create pages, they're not connected. There's no relationship to important content that's relevant in the graph. Now, to a human visitor, this might be some minor inconsistency. They found a page that doesn't quite fit. It's a fragment with no home. But these fragments without homes, they don't just disappear. They're still going to get learned by the AI, just without context. Another common one we see in this pattern is a faculty directory with names, titles, and maybe phone numbers, but no research interests or courses, no connections to the departments that they represent, or maybe students they're mentoring. A person with no relationships, they don't really have a place in the graph. They're just not going to show up. Or press releases, other records that are created at a time. Maybe it's about a renamed college or a new program launch, a research partnership that kicked off. It goes out, it gets indexed, but without more structured content getting built around it, these announcements kind of sit. They were written for a news cycle, not to be part of a larger knowledge system. So that version of the story, written for a journalist, ends up becoming the foundational answer AI is going to give it going forward. And none of this is surprising. Like someone made a reasonable decision of what they should do with content when they had to. But these very reasonable decisions made without a shared understanding of what this content's supposed to be, what it connects to, where it lives, and what it's supposed to teach, it starts to accumulate into an institution that's slowly, invisibly describing itself incorrectly. This cost used to be friction, which is manageable and human. The cost now is more of a permanent lesson being taught to systems that never forget and rarely check for updates. I mean, these tools, the AI systems, they're more than capable of searching the web. And I bet a lot of folks listening right now explicitly instruct them to do tasks on the web. But in general, they're searching against their own training, their own knowledge. And you might not get a chance to update that for the next 6 months until that new model comes out. And while this problem is real, I think I've made it more than clear. Um, the common cause behind I don't want to make it sound like it's malice or laziness. It's usually just information arriving too late, in the wrong place or to the wrong person. An editor would have fixed the problem if they even knew it existed. Or maybe the solution you have started as a content audit or a governance task force, but that's often a rough road to travel. One of the best things you can do is put the signal right in front of the right person at the moment they're ready to act. Because editors, they're not logging into your CMS at random. They're arriving with purpose. And that moment of intent is exactly when the information about the content's health becomes action. Not in some quarterly PDF delivered by email, but right when they're ready to work. Four Kitchens helped build this with Stanford Humanities and Sciences in their publishing platform. This tool surfaces orphaned entities. That's content that exists but maybe has lost some connections. And we can at least validate that. Recently imported records that may technically be correct but editorially incomplete. I see content that hasn't just been touched in a long time, or maybe has accessibility issues and is worth a second look. This is something that's not lecturing. It's not something that's a report to your manager. But what it's doing, it's putting a prioritized, actionable list right in front of the person who can fix it at the moment they're ready to fix it. And this feedback loop that may have taken months in old processes can now be run in minutes. When thinking about all the different kinds of content I've been kind of diving into, I want to spend a little extra time on events because I think it represents the biggest missed opportunity in this knowledge base, this sort of graph we're building. I want to ask, what if an event didn't expire, but it started to accumulate? And my favorite example of this is Wharton. They figured it out about 25 years ago when in 1999, Knowledge at Wharton launched. And it was this simple idea. Faculty research and expertise shouldn't just live in lecture halls or in journals. It should persist. It should travel. It should be discoverable by anyone long after the call or the conference talk or the publication is hit or landed or launches. And so today they have this very searchable interface of more than 10,000 articles, podcasts, videos, where every piece is named, tied to a faculty member, linked to their research, tagged by topic, organized into curated series. So a lecture doesn't just happen on a date, it becomes an article. It joins a series, it connects to a body of work that starts to compound over time. And this is more than a content strategy just bolted on, say, after a press release or an event has passed. This is a different model, one where the event is the beginning of the content, not the end of it. And Wharton's not alone in this thinking. Healthline is another great example of an organization that treats attribution, citation, and authorship as core to the product. It's not an afterthought. They have consistently placed summaries at the top of their content, related content, and credible sources in different parts. So I think I had a screenshot of that. Oh, yes, citations, where every article connects to people, expertise, and evidence in a way that makes that content easy for humans and machines to understand. The Gates Foundation, I think, is another great example of showing how an organization can step back and intentionally shape their narrative through something like an annual report. So instead of relying on a stream of press releases, which is written for journalists in a moment, we have this bigger report. It's an aggregate of what's being said over the course of a year, synthesized into a coherent, just structured statement of impact. I'd love to see this more at some of the universities I work with in their research offices because they have so much wonderful content to share, but it kind of gets buried in time. This kind of report connects initiatives, people, and outcomes, and all that wonderful data you want to promote into a way that's meant to endure and not expire. Uh, Another one of my favorites is the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. It's a strong example of how an organization can treat people and also the labs they work in as first-class entities in that content model. This isn't just about having profiles, it's biographical pages that become hubs that connect research areas to lab work and publications, and really the institutional impact told as a story. So that from a single person, you can navigate outwards into the science itself and the teams behind it, and broader questions you could start to explore. And the difference between a system of presentation or understanding is really this. One serves the moment and the other outlasts it. And in this way, when a 17-year-old prospective student asks, like, what is it like to be on campus? They're not just going to get an answer shaped by your student life page, which hopefully does answer that question nicely. But instead, they have access to years worth of real events, student stories, achievements, and connection to the people actually living there. And I think this is sort of the part of my thesis where I get to say, like, this is the durable content that I started talking about. And it takes a lot of work to do this intentionally. But I think we could start small. In fact, there's one I'm working on right now with Yale News, where they're starting to subtly restructure how they publish journalism by simply adding annotations, with these little asides and citations that are designed to support how AI systems read, interpret, and reference their work. This isn't just metadata. You're going to hear a lot of that in AI talks, like here's the latest JSON LD. Yes, this metadata is great, but this is deliberate content, and it's really the more foundational piece you need before you get to the nuance of tracking all of your metadata and such. This is real content that a human might read once, but since it's sourced, an AI can cite it, it can summarize it, it can repeat it in other contexts. All right, I'm nearing the end, so let's talk next steps. Because I don't know. When I think about this stuff, the number of sites I've redesigned over the years, we often kick off with, let's redesign content types. Let's do a content audit. Let's rethink governance and write some policy on updating things. All great tasks, but I think you could start with something very simple this week. Just ask. Open ChatGPT, open Perplexity, open Claude, and ask about your institutions the way a prospective student would. Ask what they're known for, ask what programs you offer, or what campus life is like. Ask whether it's a good fit for somebody in a specific research area, or wants to be a part of a community, or is looking for a specific career path. And then read the answers carefully. Not just for accuracy, I mean, that's important, but also for recognition. Does the answer provided by this agent sound like you? Does it reflect who you are now, or who you were 5 years ago? And is it specific and confident, or is it vague in a way that sort of suggests the underlying signal was weak, in a way that really could describe any of your peer institutions? And on that, repeat this process for one of your peer institutions and compare the answers. You're going to feel a difference immediately if one group has content that is coherent, well organized, and well modeled, and one that is maybe assembled in a less consistent way. You've spent years asking, like, what should my content look like? I want to reframe it now and say, like, what do you want to teach with your content? And this becomes a diagnostic. Luckily, it costs nothing. I mean, about 20 minutes, I can ask these questions. And I think most of our peers have never done it before, or not in a serious way where you run an experiment with everyone in your team in a room, project it up on the screen with all the folks who make decisions about content's governance, and watch them maybe squirm as it answers in real time. because the conversations that are going to follow are going to be very real, and it's really impossible for us to have this in the abstract. We need to see what the risk is. There is a bigger ask, though, because everything I described today, the stale content, the orphaned entities, the invisible people, the events that disappear, none of this is going to get fixed by a web team just working harder, because this isn't strictly a web problem. It's more of an ownership problem. Right now, for most organizations, no one's going to answer that question I asked of, who's responsible for what we're teaching AI systems. It's not about what your website looks like, what it teaches. And the honest answer at most places is no one has this responsibility. It's too strategic for the web team. It's too technical for your communications group. It's too operational for leadership. And so it ends up belonging to everybody and therefore belonging to no one. And in that gap, something else steps in. The LLMs are going to assemble an answer from everything you've published. It's going to weigh what appears most frequently, and it's going to carry it forward without intent or correction. And that becomes the version of your institution that gets described to others. Because AI is not going to wait for us to be ready. It's already reading what's out there, synthesizing it, finding it, and it's moving on. And your content is already teaching. So now the question is whether you're the one deciding what that message is. Thank you all so much for listening to me about this topic today. I'm so excited to keep this conversation going. So if there's any questions, I'd love to talk about them now.
Feel free to add questions to the chat. I don't see any at the moment, but if you have questions, definitely feel free to either raise your hand or ask them in the chat. Yeah, it was a great presentation, Jeff.
Thank you. This is some tough stuff to put down because the landscape of these tools is changing so frequently that 3 months ago it would have been a different talk, and that's actually when I started writing this. So it is tough to keep up, and I appreciate the university wanting to have this conversation because I expect there to be an emerging risk in the next few months, especially definitely within the next year, where we're going to see less traffic. And it doesn't mean that we're losing our audience. We're just losing those first steps. We're going to have a lot more conversations happening outside of our space. And I think the initial result is going to be some panic as that top of our funnels move off-site. But
Yeah,
like so many other things in my career, whether it's been SEO or really most of my career started around accessibility, a good coherent content model that's thoughtful is going to sustain us.
awesome. Okay, I do have a few questions. I'll start at the first one from Chris. I believe it's Ruggin. Repetition. How do you balance that against the risk of redundancy? How do you balance that against the risk of redundancy?
I'll have to think about, there's a few ways I can answer that, so feel free to clarify. But um, the study I cited before had talked about how AI is not going to necessarily pick the most authoritative. It's going to pick the version of the fact that happens the most often. That's not necessarily encouragement to say something more often. That ends up often diluting the signal. I mean, the most extreme version of that was the degree finder, where every facet had similar programs. And so that ends up being just wasted. It's generic, it's all blended together into the same content over and over again. So I would apply the same content strategy principles you would do outside of marketing, but to real content strategy work. Um, and with maybe one exception, we've always assumed that a good no robot or good robots.txt file might keep people away from redundant copy. And so you might have a program landing page that's how to get started on this uh, RN to BSN path for nurses looking to continue education. And you write it for folks at different stages of their life. And we would put maybe a no robots up because it's part of an ad campaign. And we have one canonical version and then four variations that are almost the same thing. And they all say the number one thing to learn is this, but it's all slightly different. We can't count on that um, solving any problems anymore. So I would just make sure that in aggregate, you're not mixing your messages if you have to have redundant content. and I would eliminate it as much as possible. I also didn't explicitly say it, but for better or worse, it's not just what you have on your site. If someone says something about you, that is part of the record too. And that could work in your favor. If everyone's saying that you have the best public policy program in the nation, that it ends up being a story that writes itself, even though you're not the one who said it.
Awesome. Thank you. I got another question just going through the chat. I believe it's Ann Bonham. Are you saying we shouldn't have faceted program search pages at all? Uh,
It's difficult. I really love the ability to hot link to a thing. There, I could do a whole separate talk on appropriate use of facets. It is still a great way to help, human users dig down, but it's probably not the primary way. And if we're designing for robots, I'm guessing we should have something a little more curated, either on our home pages or at the top of that program guide. So at Four Kitchens, we've worked up one proof of concept that was an AI first approach. Um, Now, in that one, we were actually building a chatbot, and I don't think that's what this conversation is. Um, the important part was, though, that in line with the program guide, we were able to surface things like student stories, information about the location and the community. So we were thinking of it a little more holistically than just being a list of programs. The facets themselves end up being more of a problem with bots, and there's a lot of techniques now on how you can avoid that. So take a peek. There's no shortage of conference talks on that subject, but being able to block the bots from your facets is probably the more important thing than getting rid of that pattern outright.
awesome. And then from Andrea, what do you think of schema and the marketing push towards AEO?
I love it. Yeah, this is kind of weird because I still hate all of the hundreds of hours I've put on some sites in my past at a previous job, when I worked for a different university, of getting all that metadata tooling set up because we set it up to have better SEO. And then we realized quickly there was no one in charge of writing that in a clear and consistent way. A few high level landing pages got written, but to be able to scale that out to the entire site at 10,000 pages was never going to happen in any significant way. And so I'm trying really hard to not react from that experience of like, no, don't do it. It is important. And being able to use the schema standard and adopt something like the JSON LD to be able to surface things like annotations, I think that's a nice next step. But without good content, I think it's too soft an optimization, and it's probably not enough. It's unfortunate that a lot of these tools are just kind of looking at pages at the surface level right now, but definitely take it on. I just wouldn't make that the primary initiative unless you can say with confidence that your site is up to date and that you're happy with where the content is holistically.
Awesome. I'm just going through to see if we can how many questions we can get. There's a few in the chat. The next one was for a large institution, there is so much distributed content ownership, thousands of websites. Does syndication become a meaningful way to solve that type of context?
I think so. The hard part there is always tooling. We live in a place with fragmented IT departments or maybe tools that have, 10 or 15 years between them. So it's not always realistic. And without a good governance push to maybe sunset some of the ones that aren't doing you justice, you're going to have to live with it. So just from a practical standpoint, make noise, maybe do that activity that I talked about where you're asking perplexity in the room with somebody who's going to be uneasy with the answer, questions about your institution. And when they cite something that you're unhappy with, you can say, hey, look, this old system that doesn't get updated often is actually becoming a problem. It's eroding some trust. It's creating some weak signals. And even though it's buried on some subdomain, it's problematic. So I think I would love to see things consolidate and become syndicated, but that's often not a cheap process. At a lot of research institutions, there's a few players, and I'm trying to remember the names of them. Is it Profile and I don't remember the names of all of them, but that will index your people in research groups. I think that's great if there's an off-the-shelf component that you can sort of drop into your existing website or other channels that look at all that people and metadata. A lot of us might work in a CMS and we have control of our data model. If you could syndicate that, fantastic. For the NDSU site I shown, we have a lot of different templates for the same content. Those stories have, I don't know how many permutations as they're embedded in other parts of the content because it might look more like a quote or it might be something more prominent. And so being able to take a canonical source and service it in a fairly automated way, maybe through tagging or something else dynamic, just ensures that you don't have that sort of content rot, that slow erosion.
Awesome. We have 4 minutes left. I have, let's see, two questions in the chat. I also want to give you time to wrap up or give any last remarks. Would you like me to read out the one of the questions? I see it's some feedback. Some people have kind of emoji, so it might be a good one. Or what's your thoughts?
Please bring it. I can't see this
Okay,
tools right now, how I'm set
there
up.
it goes. We are starting to have some interest in hiding content from LLM training. How do you balance ease of access from real users having LLM signal and yet also hiding certain research or artwork from LLM training?
Yeah, this has been, a big disappointment for me. For Kitchens, one of the things I love about us, I have so many t-shirts that say setting knowledge free. And I wish I could mean that all the time, but you're talking about cases where that's the trust that we used to have in these systems is gone. So I have moved recently to a place of embracing intranets. And I've never been in that place before. I've always liked to be open and think somebody's going to get value from this. And that's honestly the only way I've been able to, with confidence, say that this knowledge is protected is to put it behind some sort of a password protection system, or to put it in some place we know those robots can't get to it at least easily. I don't love it, but I just don't trust any of the companies. And if I do have trust in them now, I won't have trust them in the future. So this talk is maybe more cautionary about AI, but also accepting that they're going to get that content. I don't know that I answered the whole question, so feel free to restate it if I went off script there.
I think it did. I think you did. I got one more question. We got 2 minutes, but I'll throw this
Okay.
one out to you, see if we can get some good insight from you on this one. Is how do you suggest we try to figure out what kinds of question folks are asking AI? It feels like a black box wherein we have no analytics. So maybe if you know any tools or any ways to get that information, or some insight on how people can go about understanding what kinds of questions are getting asked from through AI.
Sure. I would well, let me say I'm hoping that a lot of your organizations have some personas already established. And if you don't, that's a fun activity, but also kind of an expensive one to get started. So you can start much simpler. There's a number of associations that kind of share what's important to the up and coming high school students, and at this point, something I didn't know, their families. That's something that's a very much a trend that's changed in the last just several years, to have families come to their site asking very different kinds of questions. So I'm hoping you have personas or another research group, or maybe even talking to, say, admissions counselors that are able to translate the questions that come in an email, chat, and other systems into something that you can take away. That to me would be invaluable market research. But beyond that, feel free to just interview the people that you know that are 17. Because I'll be honest, every time we've done that kind of an activity, and our CEO recently had talked to some folks that were looking for career direction, uh, it's not what I would have predicted. So I think you really do need some real research, whether it's grassroots sourcing it from the source or talking to your frontline staff or maybe marketing department. I think more important than accuracy is going to be the totality of it. So asking some basic questions and saying, does this even sound like me, should be a pretty triggering moment. Getting to the accuracy, of course, is important, but that could take a lot of timing to look through your content and figure out how to get there. So, does it even sound like you? I've seen a lot of groups say, no, this could be any university.
Awesome. I appreciate that, Jim, and I appreciate all of the attendees to the keynote for today's session. We will be starting our next sessions at 11 a.m. So we'll take a quick break check out the schedule, join a session. It looks like we have some good stuff coming up. Claude Code with Drupal, how to solve a problem like profiles, co-designing an inclusive staff profile solution, learn RAG components and best practices, optimizing productivity for client success. So again, thank you, Jim. I appreciate you greatly. Everyone else, have a great rest of your camp. I'll see y'all soon.
Thank you.